The wind cut across the cracked parking lot like it had a personal grudge against anyone brave enough to stand in it. Clara Whitlock hugged her worn denim jacket tighter around her ribs as she stepped out of the bus station, her boots crunching over gravel that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The town sign creaked overhead, announcing Cedar Hollow, population 1. 842 inches in peeling paint that told its own story about how long hope had been fading here. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, the only thing she owned that wasn't borrowed, donated, or second-hand. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the familiar weight of rejection already pressing against her chest. She had been in 6 towns in 8 months. 6 towns, 23 job interviews, 23 polite smiles that turned stiff when they glanced at the blank spaces in her employment history or noticed the faint scar running from her temple to her jawline. The scar was impossible to hide. Not that she tried anymore. Clara walked toward Main Street, rehearsing the same speech she had memorized months ago. She was reliable. She worked hard. She learned quickly. She never missed shifts. She never complained. She could do anything. She always told them anything at all. The first place she tried was a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and fried onions soaked into the wallpaper. The bell chimed as she stepped in, and 3 locals turned to stare before quickly pretending they weren't. The waitress behind the counter gave her a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Help wanted sign outside," Clara said gently. The waitress nodded. "Managers in the back." Clara waited while her pulse thudded like it was trying to escape her ribs. When the manager appeared, he was a heavy-set man with flour dusting his apron and suspicion lining his forehead. He glanced at her application for less than 10 seconds. "We're looking for someone with recent experience," he said, handing the paper back without meeting her eyes. "I learn fast." Clara replied quietly. "I'm sure you do," he said, already turning away. That was it. The entire interview. 15 seconds that crushed another small piece of her resolve. She stepped back into the cold, inhaling sharply as if the air might somehow steady her spinning thoughts. But the familiar whisper crept in again, the one that followed her from town to town. "Maybe they're right. Maybe you're broken." She swallowed hard and moved on. By mid-afternoon, Clara had visited for more businesses: a hardware store, a feed supply outlet, a laundromat, and a small motel whose owner didn't even let her finish introducing herself. Each rejection stacked like stones in her chest until breathing felt like work. She found herself sitting on a bench outside the town's tiny grocery store, watching pickup trucks roll by like they had somewhere important to be. People glanced at her with quick, guarded looks. Outsiders were rare in Cedar Hollow. Outsiders with scars were rarer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She hesitated before pulling it out. The screen showed a reminder she had forgotten to delete. Probation check-in call, 3 p.m. Her stomach twisted. She stared at the notification until the screen went dark again. She hadn't missed a check-in yet. Missing one could send everything crashing down again. But the thought of explaining, once more, that she still hadn't found stable employment felt like swallowing broken glass. Clara leaned forward, elbows on her knees, staring at her boots. They were cracked along the seams, but she kept them polished anyway. Her father used to say a person could survive anything if they kept their boots clean. And their word cleaner. Her father had believed that until the night everything burned. She shut her eyes, forcing the memory back into the locked corners of her mind. That night had taken everything: her home, her reputation, and the version of herself that trusted the world to be fair. When she finally stood up, the sun was already lowering behind the hills, casting long shadows that made the town feel smaller, tighter, like it was folding inward. Across the street, she noticed a faded flyer pinned to a telephone pole. Seasonal ranch help needed. Silver Ridge Ranch, experience preferred. Ask for Mr. Callahan. She stared at the flyer for a long moment. Ranch work meant isolation, hard labor, long hours, probably another rejection. Still, it was the only lead she had left. Silver Ridge Ranch sat 5 miles outside town, tucked between rolling hills that shimmered gold under the dying sunlight. Clara walked the entire distance, her legs aching, but her determination pushing her forward step after step. By the time she reached the wooden gate, dusk had settled over the land like a heavy blanket. The ranch stretched farther than she expected, acres of fencing, barns glowing faintly under hanging lanterns, and silhouettes of horses moving slowly across the fields. The air smelled like hay and earth and something strangely comforting. Clara hesitated at the gate, gripping the strap of her bag until her knuckles turned white. Every instinct told her this would end like the others. A polite refusal, a door closing, another town she would eventually leave behind. But exhaustion overpowered fear. She pushed the gate open. The crunch of gravel under her boots echoed as she approached the main barn. Inside, she could hear the low rumble of a man's voice and the restless shifting of livestock. She stepped into the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the warm lantern light. A tall figure stood near a workbench, his back turned as he tightened a horseshoe into place. His shoulders were broad, his movements steady and deliberate, like someone who measured time and seasons rather than hours. Clara cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mr. Callahan." The man didn't turn immediately. He finished tightening the last nail, brushed his hands off on a rag, and then faced her. His face was weathered but calm, with silver threading through his dark beard and eyes that held the quiet patience of someone who had seen storms come and go without panicking. "I'm Callahan," he said simply. Clara stepped forward, offering her folded application. "I saw your flyer in town. I'm looking for work." He accepted the paper but didn't look at it right away. Instead, his gaze rested on her face, on the scar she knew he noticed, on the exhaustion she couldn't hide, on the guarded tension in her posture. Silence stretched between them. Clara braced herself for the familiar dismissal. Callahan finally glanced down at the application, scanning it slowly. Clara watched his expression for signs she had learned to recognize: the tightening jaw, the subtle shift of disinterest, the polite preparation to refuse. But his face remained unreadable. "You've done ranch work before?" he asked. "No, sir. But I'm strong, and I learn fast." Another silence settled, broken only by the soft snort of a horse behind them. Callahan folded the application neatly and placed it on the workbench. Then he leaned against the wood, crossing his arms as he studied her again, not harshly, not suspiciously, just thoughtfully. Clara's heart hammered. She could feel the moment slipping toward another rejection, another closed door, another mile she would have to walk with nowhere left to go. Then Callahan spoke. "Let me ask you something, Miss Whitlock, is it?" "Yes, sir." He tilted, his head slightly, his eyes narrowing with quiet curiosity rather than judgment. "Why do you keep trying, when it's clear most folks won't give you a chance?" The question landed harder than any rejection she had ever faced. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't dismissive. It was genuine, and somehow that made it terrifying. Clara opened her mouth, then closed it again as emotion surged unexpectedly through her chest. No one had asked her that before. Not like this. Not as if the answer actually mattered. She swallowed, her voice barely steady. "Because if I stop trying," she said slowly, "then everything they think about me becomes true." The barn fell silent except for the creak of settling wood and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. Callahan held her gaze for a long moment, as if weighing something far deeper than her words. Then he pushed himself off the workbench, grabbed a second lantern, and walked toward the open stall behind him. "Sun's almost down," he said over his shoulder. "Got a mare that needs feeding and a fence line that needs checking before morning." Clara blinked, unsure what he meant. He paused, glancing back at her with the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well," he said, "you planning to stand there all night? Or you planning to prove that answer meant something?" For the first time in nearly a year, Clara felt something fragile and unfamiliar stir inside her chest. Hope. And as she stepped forward into the lantern light, she had no idea that one simple question had just begun to rewrite the entire course of her life. The mare didn't trust her. Clara noticed it immediately. The animal's ears flicked backward as she stepped into the stall, its dark eyes tracking her every movement with sharp suspicion. The horse shifted its weight, hooves scraping softly against the straw-covered floor. Clara paused just inside. The entrance, resisting the instinct to rush forward and prove she belonged there. She had learned long ago that rushing anything animals or people usually ended badly. Behind her, Callahan leaned casually against the stall frame, arms crossed, silently observing. He hadn't given her instructions. He hadn't offered encouragement. He simply handed her a feed bucket and waited. Clara swallowed, tightening her grip on the metal handle. The bucket felt heavier than it should have. Though she knew it wasn't the feed weighing her down, it was the pressure of the moment, the fragile chance she could already feel slipping between her fingers if she made one wrong move. She took one slow step forward. The mare snorted sharply, muscles tensing. Clara stopped again. "It's all right," she whispered, though she wasn't sure whether she was speaking to the animal or herself. Her voice carried softly through the stall, steady despite the nervous pulse beating in her throat. "I'm not here to hurt you." The mare's ears twitched, but it didn't retreat further. Clara remembered something her father once taught her back when she was barely tall enough to reach a horse's shoulder. He used to say animals could sense truth in a person's heartbeat. If your heart raced with fear, they felt it. If it raced with anger, they reacted to that too. But patience, real patience, was something they recognized. She set the feed bucket down slowly and extended her hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. The mare lowered its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it studied her scent. Clara forced herself to breathe evenly, refusing to let her hands tremble. Seconds stretched painfully long. She could feel Callahan's eyes watching every detail, every hesitation. Finally, the mare stepped forward and brushed its warm breath across her palm. Clara exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Behind her, Callahan said nothing, but she thought she heard the faintest shift in his stance, like approval carefully disguised as indifference. Darkness settled fully over Silver Ridge Ranch by the time they finished checking the fence line. The sky stretched wide and endless above them, stars spilling across the horizon in numbers Clara hadn't seen since she was a child. The quiet out here was different from the silence she had grown used to in lonely apartments and bus stations. The silence felt alive, filled with the distant rustle of wind through tall grass and the low hum of insects. Hidden in the fields, they walked side by side along the fence, lantern light swinging gently between them. Clara's arms ached from hauling feed sacks, and her boots were already coated with layers of dust and mud. But exhaustion carried a strange sense of satisfaction she hadn't felt in months. "You don't ask many questions," Callahan said suddenly. Clara glanced toward him, surprised by the sound of his voice breaking the quiet. "Most people don't like answering mine," she admitted. He nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he already suspected. "You been traveling long?" he asked. "About 8 months. That's a long time to be looking for work." "Yes, sir." Another stretch of silence passed between them. Clara assumed that would be the end of it. Most employers stopped digging once they realized her story carried sharp edges. But Callahan's voice came again, calm and direct. "You planning on staying in Cedar Hollow?" Clara hesitated. She had learned to avoid promises she might not be allowed to keep. "If I can find work," she said carefully. Callahan stopped walking. Clara halted beside him, her stomach tightening as she waited for whatever verdict was coming next. He rested his forearms on the top fence rail, staring out across the dim pasture where silhouettes of cattle moved slowly under the moonlight. "You show up tomorrow morning at 5, he said, still watching the field. "Work starts before sunrise. If you're late, don't bother coming back." Clara blinked, certain she had misunderstood. You mean, I have the job?" she asked quietly. Callahan finally turned toward her, his expression steady but unreadable. "I mean you have a chance," he said. "Job comes later. Chance comes first." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest so suddenly it almost hurt. She nodded quickly, afraid that if she spoke, her voice might crack under the weight of relief. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The bunkhouse smelled faintly of pine cleaner and aged wood. It was simple to narrow beds, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the eastern pasture. But to Clara, it felt like something she hadn't had in nearly a year: stability. She placed her duffel bag carefully on the floor beside one of the beds moving slowly as if sudden movements might cause the entire opportunity to vanish. The mattress creaked softly when she sat down, its worn springs still far more welcoming than the bus station benches she had grown used to for the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow. Clara allowed herself to loosen her shoulders. The quiet inside the bunkhouse wrapped around her like a protective barrier against the outside world. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. The edges were bent, and the image had faded slightly, but she traced it gently with her thumb. The photo showed a younger Clara standing beside her father in front of their old barn. Both of them were laughing, their clothes dusted with hay, sunlight pouring across their faces like it was blessing that moment. Her chest tightened. "You'd laugh if you saw me now," she murmured softly. The memory of her father's voice surfaced, warm and steady, reminding her that survival wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about refusing to let them define your ending. Clara placed the photograph inside the dresser drawer, careful and deliberate, as if storing away both comfort and pain in equal measure. Outside, she could hear distant movement from the main house, boots crossing wooden floors, a door shutting, the faint bark of a ranch dog settling in for the night. The sounds grounded her, reminding her she wasn't alone in this vast stretch of land. But beneath that fragile comfort, a familiar fear still lingered. Chances had been offered before, temporary ones, fragile ones that shattered the moment someone uncovered her past. She lay down on the bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily. Tomorrow wouldn't just be another workday. It would be another test. Morning arrived before the sun. Clara jolted awake to the sharp buzz of her phone alarm at 4:15 a.m., her body instantly alert despite the restless night behind her. For a split second, she forgot where she was. Then the scent of pine and the distant rumble of cattle pulled her back to reality. Silver Ridge Ranch. Her chance. She dressed quickly, pulling on her worn boots and tying her hair back with practiced efficiency. The early morning air slapped her awake the moment she stepped outside, cold and crisp enough to sting her lungs. The horizon glowed faintly with the first hints of dawn, painting the hills in soft shades of blue and gray. The ranch was already stirring. She spotted Callahan near the barn, unloading hay bales with quiet efficiency. His movements were steady, unhurried, like he had performed this exact routine every morning for decades. He didn't acknowledge her arrival immediately, which Clara interpreted as another silent test. She grabbed a pair of work gloves hanging near the barn entrance and joined him without speaking. The weight of the hay bale nearly buckled her knees on the first lift, but she steadied herself quickly, adjusting her grip and carrying it toward the storage loft. Minutes turned into an hour. Sweat formed across her brow despite the cold air. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she ignored the pain, matching Callahan's pace as closely as she could. Finally, he set down the last bale and glanced toward her. "You ever been around cattle drives?" he asked. "No, sir." He nodded, toward the far pasture where dust clouds were already beginning to rise in the distance. "You will be today." Clara followed his gaze, her pulse quickening. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching truck roared across the ranch road. Tires crunched over gravel as a dusty pickup skidded to a stop. Near the barn, the driver's door slammed open and a tall man stepped out, his sharp eyes landing immediately on Clara. He walked toward them with long, confident strides, removing his sunglasses slowly as he approached. His gaze lingered on Clara's face, narrowing slightly as recognition sparked behind his expression. "Well," the man said, his voice edged with disbelief, "didn't expect to see you here." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, because she recognized him to dot, and in that moment, she realized Silver Ridge Ranch might not be the safe beginning she had hoped for, but the place where her past had finally caught up with her. The man's boots struck the gravel with sharp, deliberate steps, each one echoing through Clara's chest like a warning bell. She had hoped never to hear again. The rising morning sun stretched long shadows behind him, but Clara didn't need the light to recognize him. She would have known that walk, that posture, anywhere. Evan Mercer. Her throat tightened as his name surfaced in her mind like a ghost clawing its way back into the present. He looked almost exactly the same as he had the last time she saw him, tall, clean-cut. Confidence wrapped around him like armor, only now his jawline seemed harder. His expression sharper, like life had carved new edges into him. Well, Evan repeated, stopping a few feet away. Small world, Clara. Callahan's gaze shifted between them slowly, observant but silent. Clara could feel his attention sharpening, weighing the tension that suddenly thickened the morning air. I didn't expect to see you here, Evan continued, sliding his sunglasses into his shirt pocket. Especially not working on a ranch. Clara forced her shoulders to stay squared, even as her heartbeat pounded so loudly she worried it might drown out her voice. I didn't expect to see you either. Evan let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor behind it. I do business with Callahan from time to time. Livestock transport contracts, supply exchanges. I come through every few months. Clara's stomach dropped. Out of all the ranches she could have walked into, she had chosen one connected to the only man who still carried the power to destroy everything she was trying to rebuild. Callahan finally spoke, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. You to know each other? Evan didn't hesitate. Yeah, he said smoothly. You could say that. Clara braced herself, every muscle in her body tightening as she waited for the story to spill out. The story that had followed her from town to town like a shadow that refused to fade. But Evan didn't explain, not yet. Instead, he turned his attention toward Callahan. You might want to be careful who you hire, he said casually. Some people carry more trouble than they're worth. The words sliced cleanly through the morning air. Clara felt heat rush to her face, a familiar blend of humiliation and anger clawing its way into her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but Callahan spoke first. She's working, he said. Simply. Evan raised an eyebrow. You know her background? Callahan didn't blink. I know she showed up before sunrise and hasn't slowed down since. Evan studied him for a moment, clearly surprised by the answer. Then he turned back toward Clara, his gaze colder now. Just don't say I didn't warn you, he muttered. The cattle drive preparations continued, but the rhythm of the work had shifted. Clara could feel it in the way the ranch hands glanced toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. Word traveled fast in places like this, and Evan Mercer had a reputation for never speaking without purpose. They gathered near the southern pasture fence, preparing to move a group of cattle toward higher grazing ground. Clara tightened the strap of her gloves, focusing on the physical details of the job: gates, ropes, saddle straps, anything that kept her mind from spiraling into memories she had spent years trying to bury. Callahan approached her quietly as she checked the latch on a supply crate. You all right? He asked. The question caught her off guard. Most employers didn't bother asking questions like that. Most assumed the answer didn't matter. I'm fine, she said automatically. Callahan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. That man didn't look like someone from your future, he said. He looked like someone from your past. Clara swallowed. He is. Callahan nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. You want to tell me about it? Clara's instinct screamed at her to deflect, to brush it off, to pretend it didn't matter. That instinct had kept her moving, kept her protected, kept her distant enough to survive. But she also knew secrets had a way of rotting opportunities from the inside out. If Evan decided to talk, and he would, Callahan would hear the story. Eventually, I was charged with arson, she said quietly. The words landed heavily between them. Callahan didn't react immediately. He didn't step back. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited. It was my family's barn. Clara continued, her voice steady but strained. There was a fire. The entire place burned. The investigation said faulty wiring, but she hesitated, forcing herself to finish. Evan testified that he saw me leaving the barn right before it happened. Callahan's brow tightened slightly. Did he? Yes, she whispered. And because of that testimony, I took a plea deal. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant calls of ranch hands guiding cattle through the gate. Did you start the fire? Callahan asked. Clara met his eyes. No. The cattle drive forced Clara to push her emotions aside as they guided the herd across miles of open land. Dust rose in thick clouds around them. coating her skin and filling her lungs with the sharp scent of dry earth and livestock. The physical demands left little room for thought, which she welcomed. But every time she glanced across the field, she caught glimpses of Evan's truck parked near the ridge, watching by midday. Her muscles burned and her throat felt raw from shouting commands to the cattle, yet she refused to slow down. She couldn't afford to. Not now. At one point, a young steer broke from the herd, charging toward a weak section of fencing. Clara reacted without thinking, sprinting across uneven ground and grabbing the loose gate chain before the animal could burst through. The force nearly knocked her off her feet, but she planted her boots firmly and hauled the chain tight, locking it into place just as the steer slammed against the barrier. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she held steady until the animal backed away. When she finally turned, she found Callahan watching her from horseback, his expression no longer neutral. It carried something deeper now, respect, maybe, or understanding. "You didn't hesitate," he said when he rode closer. Clara flexed her sore shoulder. "Couldn't." He nodded once, then gestured toward the horizon where the rest of the herd continued moving forward. "Most people run from things charging at them," he said quietly. "You ran toward it." Clara didn't answer. She wasn't sure she knew how. The drive ended just before sunset, the herd settling into fresh grazing fields as exhaustion settled across the ranch hands. Clara leaned against a fence post, wiping sweat and dust from her face with the back of her sleeve. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but beneath the pain, a quiet sense of accomplishment settled in her chest. She had done the work. She had kept up. For a few fragile hours, she had almost forgotten about Evan. The rumble of his truck returning shattered that illusion. Gravel crunched as he pulled up near the pasture gate, stepping out with slow, deliberate movements. The ranch hands gradually drifted away, sensing tension they wanted no part of. Evan approached Clara directly this time. "You really think this place is going to save you?" he asked quietly. "I'm not looking to be saved," she replied. "I'm looking to work." He studied her face, his expression flickering with something unreadable: regret, anger, or perhaps something darker. "You should have left town back then," he said. "I didn't burn that barn," Clara said firmly. Evan's jaw tightened. "You were there." "Yes," she admitted. "I was trying to fix the wiring before the storm hit." The admission hung heavily between them. Evan shook his head slowly. "Truth doesn't matter once people decide who you are," Clara felt. The words strike deeper than she expected, because part of her had believed them for years. Behind them, Callahan's boots approached through the grass. "That conversation done?" he asked calmly. Evan stepped back, glancing between them. "Just remember," he said to Callahan, "some fires don't stay buried." He climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving a thick cloud of dust trailing behind him like a warning. Fading into the evening sky, Clara stared at the disappearing truck, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't untangle: fear, anger, exhaustion, and beneath it all, a quiet, growing determination. Callahan stood beside her, resting his arms on the fence rail. "You told me you didn't start the fire," he said. Double quotes, "Yes." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then I guess," he said quietly, "we'd better find out who did." Clara turned toward him, stunned by the certainty in his voice. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe since the night her life collapsed. For the first time, someone wasn't just giving her a chance. Someone was standing beside her. And as the sun dipped below the hills, Clara understood that the real battle wasn't about finding work anymore. It was about uncovering a truth that had been buried in ashes for far too long. The night air carried a sharp chill that swept across Silver Ridge Ranch like a quiet warning. Clara sat on the bunkhouse porch steps, elbows resting on her knees, watching moonlight spill across the wide pastures. The cattle had settled hours ago, the ranch hands had turned in, and the world had fallen into that deep countryside silence that made every thought sound louder than it should. She hadn't slept much since Evan's visit. Memories had a cruel way of surfacing when the world grew quiet. The crackling sound of flames, the sharp sting of smoke filling her lungs, the collapsing groan of wooden beams as her family's barn burned to the ground. She could still smell it, sometimes charred hay and burning paint like the past had soaked into her skin permanently. Footsteps crunched across gravel behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Callahan. His steps were steady and unhurried, like everything else about him. He lowered himself beside her on the porch, resting his forearms on his knees in the same relaxed posture she had come to recognize. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt natural rather than awkward, something Clara wasn't used to sharing with another person. Fire reports don't disappear, Callahan said finally. Clara glanced toward him, her chest tightening slightly. What do you mean? I mean investigations leave records, witness statements, insurance reports, repair estimates, paper trails, he said calmly. And small towns remember everything. Clara stared back out toward the pasture, the moonlight blurring slightly as emotion tugged at the corners of her vision. Why would you want to dig into any of that? She asked softly. It's old history, ugly history. Callahan shrugged lightly. Truth doesn't expire. The simplicity of his answer hit her harder than any long speech could have. You really think you'd find anything different? She asked. I think, he said carefully, if a person's willing to walk 5 miles looking for work when the world keeps shutting doors in her face, then there's usually more to her story than what's written on paper. Clara felt her throat tighten again, but she didn't look away. The steady calm in his voice carried something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in years. Faith, not blind faith, earned faith, and that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. The Cedar Hollow Records office smelled like dust, aging paper, and forgotten history. Clara stood beside Callahan as he signed the visitor log, the clerk watching them with curious eyes over the rim of her reading glasses. You're looking for files from 9 years ago? The clerk asked. Yes, ma'am, Callahan replied politely. Property fire reports, Whitlock Farm. Clara felt the air shift around her the moment her last name was spoken. Even after nearly a decade, it still carried weight here. Weight she could feel pressing against her ribs as the clerk disappeared into the storage room. Behind the counter. You don't have to stay, Clara whispered. Callahan didn't look at her. I know. The clerk returned several minutes later carrying a thick folder. Its edges yellowed with age. She placed it gently on the counter, like she was setting down something fragile or dangerous. Clara hesitated before opening it. Her hands hovered above the file, trembling slightly as she stared at her own last name printed across the tab. The moment felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one step forward would force her to relive everything she had spent years trying to bury. Callahan slid the folder closer to her, but didn't touch it. Clara inhaled slowly and opened it. The first pages contained photographs of the barn after the fire. Blackened beams collapsed inward, twisted metal roofing, ash layered thick across the ground like a blanket of snow. The images struck her like physical blows, dragging memories into the present with brutal clarity. She flipped further, scanning insurance statements, damage assessments, and emergency response summaries. Then she reached the witness section. Her eyes landed on Evan Mercer's statement. Her pulse spiked as she read the words she had memorized years ago. He claimed he saw her leaving the barn carrying a tool bag shortly before smoke began rising from the roofline. He claimed she looked panicked. He claimed she refused to explain why she had been there so late during a storm warning. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep reading. Then Callahan leaned closer, his finger resting on a line halfway down the page. What's that? He asked quietly. Clara followed his finger. Another name sat beneath Evans. A second witness. Her breath caught in her throat. The second witness name read Thomas Grady. Clara blinked, her mind scrambling through fragmented memories. She vaguely remembered the name, an electrical contractor, hired to inspect the farm wiring several weeks before the fire. At the time, she had barely spoken to him, assuming her father handled all business matters personally. He testified. She whispered. Callahan skimmed the report carefully. Looks like he confirmed faulty wiring caused the fire, he said. But it says his statement was filed 3 days after the investigation closed. Clara frowned. That doesn't make sense. Callahan flipped through additional pages, his brow tightening as he read. He left town 2 weeks after the fire. He added, "No forwarding address listed." Clara's chest tightened. Something about that detail scratched against her instincts, the same instincts that had kept her moving from town to town, always sensing danger just before it arrived. Why would someone confirm faulty wiring? After the case was already closed, she asked. Callahan didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the report, his expression sharpening with quiet focus. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people don't file statements to explain what happened. Sometimes they file them to control how the story ends." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. "You think he lied?" she asked. "I think." Callahan replied carefully, "We don't know enough yet to decide who told the truth." They left the record's office just as storm clouds began rolling across the Cedar Hollow sky, thick and heavy like history preparing to repeat itself. The wind picked up as they walked toward Callahan's truck, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Clara clutched copies of the witness statements against her chest, her thoughts racing faster than she could control. "Callahan," she said suddenly, stopping beside the truck, "what if digging into this just makes things worse? What if people don't want the truth uncovered?" He rested one hand on the truck door, studying her carefully. "You worried about them?" he said. "Or worried about what you might find?" Clara didn't answer, because she wasn't sure. Thunder rumbled across the distant hills, low and ominous. The sound triggered a memory so sharp it stole her breath, the same rolling thunder that had echoed the night her barn caught fire, the same storm that had swallowed her life whole. Callahan opened the truck door, then paused. "You ever notice storms don't destroy everything?" he asked quietly. Clara looked at him, confused. "They clear dead branches," he continued. "Wash dust off fields. Sometimes they tear things apart, but sometimes they make room for something stronger to grow." Rain began falling in slow, heavy drops around them. Clara stared down at the witness statements in her hands, the ink slightly smudging as raindrops struck the paper. For years, she had been running from the ashes of her past, convinced survival meant never looking back, but standing there, watching the storm roll in beside someone who refused to let her carry the weight alone. Clara felt something shift deep inside her. Determination replaced fear. "If we do this," she said slowly, "there's no turning back." Callahan nodded once. "Good," he said. "I've never trusted roads that lead backward anyway." Lightning split across the darkening sky, illuminating the valley in a brief, blinding flash. And as thunder followed, Clara realized the storm she had been running from for 9 years was finally here. Only this time, she wasn't running anymore. The storm arrived with violent certainty. Rain hammered Silver Ridge Ranch through the night, rattling windows and turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Clara sat at the small kitchen table inside Callahan's house, witness statements spread across the surface like puzzle pieces refusing to connect cleanly. A lantern flickered beside her, casting long shadows that danced across the documents. She hadn't slept. Callahan leaned against the counter, quietly reading through the copied reports again, his expression carved into focused calm. The storm outside echoed the storm inside Clara's chest, loud, relentless, impossible to ignore. "I keep thinking about the timeline," Clara said, tracing her finger across Evan's statement. "He said he saw me leaving the barn minutes before smoke started rising, but the emergency call logs show the fire had already been reported when he claimed he saw me." Callahan nodded slowly, meaning he either saw smoke earlier than he admitted, or he was there before you left. Clara's heart pounded as realization tightened around her lungs. "He worked security patrol for the county back then," she whispered. "He had access to emergency frequencies. He would have known if someone called in the fire." Callahan stepped closer to the table, studying the insurance records beside the witness statements. "You said your father recently expanded the farm before the fire," he said. "Yes." "New equipment loans?" "Yes." He slid a separate document toward her, an insurance policy record she had barely noticed earlier. "Your father increased the barn insurance coverage to months before the fire," Callahan said. Clara frowned. That was normal. He was storing more livestock and equipment. "Maybe," Callahan said. "But look at the cosigner." Clara's eyes scanned the page. Her breath caught violently in her throat. Evan Mercer's father's revelation hit Clara like collapsing ground beneath her feet. She stared at the document, her mind racing through memories she hadn't examined closely enough before. Evan's father had been her family's business partner years ago, helping manage supply shipments and equipment financing. After the fire, he had taken over several of her father's contracts. "You think this was about money?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible over the rain battering the windows. Callahan didn't answer immediately. He flipped through the financial reports, piecing together timelines with slow, methodical precision. "After the fire," he said carefully, "your family defaulted on equipment, loans. The land was partially sold, contracts transferred, and Mercer Logistics expanded their livestock transport routes across this region." Clara felt nausea twist in her stomach. "They profited from everything my family lost," she whispered. Callahan nodded once. "Looks that way." Silence filled the room, except for thunder rolling across the hills. Clara pressed her palms against the table, grounding herself as waves of anger and heartbreak surged through her chest. "There's still Thomas Grady," she said suddenly. "The second witness, the electrician." Callahan leaned back slightly. "Considering you said he disappeared after filing his statement." "Yes." Callahan reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts before dialing a number Clara didn't recognize. He waited silently, rain pounding louder against the roof as the call connected. "Sheriff Dalton?" he said. "This is Callahan from Silver Ridge. I need you to run a background trace on a man named Thomas Grady." Clara held her breath as Callahan listened to the sheriff's response. Then Callahan's expression hardened. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. He ended the call and turned toward Clara. "Grady didn't disappear," he said. "He changed his name and works 3 counties over as a senior electrical inspector." 2 days later, Clara sat across from Thomas Grady inside a small rural inspection office. The man looked older than she remembered, gray streaks lining his beard, guilt weighing heavily in the deep lines round his eyes. Callahan stood beside her, silent but steady, his presence anchoring her as she placed the old witness statement on Grady's desk. "You filed this after the investigation closed," Clara said. "Why?" Grady stared at the document for a long moment, his shoulders sagging as if a weight he had carried for years had suddenly doubled. "I knew you. Come eventually," he muttered. Clara's pulse quickened. "Then tell me the truth." Grady rubbed his hands across his face, exhaling shakily. "The wiring wasn't faulty," he admitted. "It needed upgrades, but it wouldn't have caused a fire that fast. Not like that." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she forced herself to stay focused. "Then what caused it?" she demanded. Grady swallowed hard. "Accelerant." The word struck like thunder. "I found traces of it in the electrical room during my post-fire inspection," he continued. "But before I could file an official report, Evan's father approached me." Clara's fists clenched. "He offered me a promotion, a relocation contract, double salary," Grady said, his voice cracking. "I convinced myself it didn't matter. The barn was gone. The damage was done. I told myself your family would recover. They didn't," Clara whispered. "I know," Grady said, his voice breaking. "And I've lived with that every day since." Callahan stepped forward slightly. "Are you willing to testify to that now?" Grady nodded slowly, tears pooling in his eyes. "Yes." Part for the confrontation happened 3 weeks later inside Cedar Hollow's courthouse. The storm clouds that once haunted Clara's memories were replaced by bright sunlight streaming through tall courtroom windows. Yet her hands still trembled as she sat beside Callahan, listening as Grady delivered sworn testimony exposing falsified fire reports and financial manipulation tied to the Mercer family. Evan sat across the courtroom, his expression unraveling with each statement revealed. His confident posture had collapsed into rigid tension as evidence stacked against him: emergency frequency records, altered insurance documentation, and Grady's confession detailing the bribe. When Evan finally took the stand, his voice carried none of the certainty Clara remembered. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he admitted quietly. "My father just wanted control of the contracts. I was supposed to scare Whitlock into selling earlier. The fire It spread faster than we planned. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Clara felt her breath leave her chest in a shaky release she had held for 9 years. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't look away as Evan's words collapsed the false story that had defined her life. For nearly a decade, the charges were filed within hours: fraud, arson, conspiracy, perjury. By sunset, Clara stood outside the courthouse steps, sunlight warming her face as townspeople whispered around her, not with suspicion this time, but with something unfamiliar. Respect. Callahan stepped beside her, his hat casting a shadow across his calm, steady eyes. "You all right?" he asked. Clara exhaled slowly, watching wind ripple through nearby wheat fields. For the first time since the fire, the memories didn't feel like chains pulling her backward. They felt like scars, painful, permanent, but healed, I think, she said softly. "I finally am." Callahan nodded, then tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same thoughtful curiosity he had shown the night she first walked into his barn. "So," he said, his voice carrying that familiar quiet strength, "you planning on staying? Or you planning on proving that chance meant something?" Clara smiled, small, genuine, and unburdened. "I'm staying," she said. They walked back toward the truck together as the sun dipped low across Cedar Hollow's horizon. The ranch waited for them, the cattle, the fences, the long days of work that would stretch across seasons instead of survival weeks. Clara glanced back once toward the courthouse, toward the place where her past had finally been laid to rest. Then, she turned forward again, because the simple question that one rancher had asked months ago hadn't just given her a job. It had given her back her life. And this time, she intended to build something no fire could ever destroy.